Welcome back guys to another video. So I have made yet another self-portrait. This is number 22 in my ever-growing list of self-portraits. And it was a really interesting journey. I had actually started this painting 2 years ago. I've shown this painting a bit when talking about how I sketch out my portraits and how I make my underpaintings. However, it was after the underpainting I hit a bit of a snag with this portrait. I really liked the initial look, but once I started adding some more color with the first layer of oil paint, I got very frustrated because it just wasn't looking how I wanted it to. Ultimately, I put it on the back burner for 2 years while I worked on other paintings and drawings and commissions, and it was this year that I finally felt comfortable enough to get back to it. So in the first layer I didn't have a lot going on, besides a bit of color and some small spots of shadows. So my goal here with the new layer of oil paint was to bring variation of values as well as color. With my last couple of portraits, I felt that I had gotten better at mixing out skin colors, and I really wanted to focus on bringing that variation. While working on this, I also decided to switch the direction of the eyes and instead had them become forward facing. Now throughout this entire painting, I did use a debatably inconveniently sized brush to paint this portrait. There is something about using such a small brush that gives me a great sense of control, and I also frankly just don't like switching out brushes while painting. Now for the rest of the second layer, I continued focusing on values, on form, as well as color. I did try to be mindful of how I was mixing color. I have the tendency to make the colors way too pale and desaturated, but also B, make my colors way too saturated and orangey. So I'm really walking opposite ends of the spectrum at all times. So while mixing colors, I tried to make it saturated, but also using a bit more reds, so there are also pinks and peachy colors that shine through, especially in the lighter areas, so it doesn't just feel like different shades of orange. That being said, I didn't want to worry too hard if the color was a bit off, because I could always adjust it later on with another layer. With the skin on the face done, I moved on to the lips and the rest of the skin. Lips are always an odd place for me because I always have trouble getting the color right. I have a bit of a habit of making it too pale, but I really didn't want a repeat of waiting another 2 years just because I got a little stuck. So I kept powering through and reminding myself that everything can be adjusted. The rest of the skin was the same process as the face, just focusing on creating that initial layer that will serve as my foundation for the next layers to come. I started out with the shadows and worked my way towards the left side of the painting where everything was a bit lighter for the most part. When it comes to portraits, I typically like working in sections as it makes everything feel much more manageable. When I was comfortable with how the skin looked, I decided to go in and paint the background. Now, I usually like getting the background in relatively early because it does somewhat change how the rest of your colors will look. So having that done before I refine the skin was really important to me. I ended up going for a blue background because I thought it would work well with the warmth of the skin. And like the skin, I used a smaller brush to paint the background. Now, I do have larger brushes, but I kind of like the subtle texture I get when using a small brush to cover such a large space. After the background came painting the necklace. Although I have painted a necklace before, it was done with acrylic in a slightly different style. So I was a bit worried on how it would turn out, but I just focused in on shape and let it become a necklace rather than getting lost in the details. Making the colors for the necklace was rather simple. I started off by making a deep yellow tone brown that I then lightened and mixed in with additional bits of yellow paint to make the midtones and lighter values. While painting, I also thought it would be really fun if instead of using the dark brown to make the little holes that you would see in the links of the chain, I thought it would be nice to write my name to create that illusion from far away. I also used these same colors to paint the earrings. With the jewelry done, it was time for the hair. I started off with mixing out a warm black for the shadow, using that for the areas right by the earrings and on the right side of the face where it would be darkest. Then using that same color, I started painting the eyebrow hairs, which took quite a bit of time as I was painting out every single hair individually. And I do end up painting over them a bit afterwards, so I don't know if it was really the most effective use of my time, but it was very satisfying to do. Then came the rest of the hair. So I had mixed out a lighter brown than what I had going on in the shadows, which is where I probably had the biggest revelation of my life. Like I said earlier, I've made 22 self-portraits, and yet I always had this feeling that something was a bit off, but I can never quite pinpoint what. And it wasn't until I started this first layer of hair that I realized I had simply been making my hair too light. My entire life, I've said my hair was brown, when really it is a lot closer to being black than anything else, albeit with a brown undertone. So with that in mind, I had let the first layer of hair dry before ultimately going back in and darkening up my hair. I mixed out a similar warm brown, borderline black that I used previously for the shadows by the earrings and started covering the hair with that, leaving some areas alone where I wanted there to be highlights. For the highlights, I did two different colors. One that was a bit more like a cool gray, which was great in relation to the blue background. But I also did quite a bit of a warm brown, and that's because I'm painting a younger version of myself at a time in which I had some of my hair bleached. So I still wanted to have some lighter bits of brown. And after finishing up the hair is when things took a turn and got a little scary, but I'm gonna need you to just trust me a minute. So after I had finished the hair, I realized the skin was looking quite pale. Now in the video, it doesn't look too bad, but in person, the difference felt quite big, and some of the values were just not dark enough anymore compared to the hair. So I decided I wanted to go back in and bring some warmth and shadows. However, I fear I locked in a little too hard and gave myself what I can only refer to as the most atrocious spray tan to ever exist. And let this be a future reminder to myself to never paint at night. So after a brief panic and calling it a night, I came back the next day and toned it way down. I still kept some of the warmth, but by blending in a slightly lighter and pinkish shade, I was able to tone down the orange into a much more acceptable looking skin color that you see now. And I continued this process of toning it down while also bringing some highlights that I had lost in the process. At this time, I also went ahead and finished up the rest of the skin, both adjusting color but also adjusting form in some of the areas like around the collarbone where the shapes were just a bit off. At this point, it was a lot more about adjusting the smaller things and making sure everything felt right, both in value and color, and again in shape. Other things that I ended up adjusting were also the lips, which again did not feel right to me throughout the entire process, really. But I went ahead and adjusted the color and also brought in some more highlights so it felt a little bit more realistic. Similarly, in some areas like the nose, I adjusted the shape as well as the intensity of the shadows. I feel like in some areas it got a bit too light for my taste and I lost some of the stronger shadows. And in some areas I felt like the shadows needed a bit more blending and it needed to get a little bit more lost. Now, to blend some of these areas out, in some cases I just used the brush that I had been using the entire time with a little bit of paint. However, in some areas where I just wanted to blur the edges a bit more, I did end up using a different brush, which I am pretty sure is actually an eyeshadow brush. But I used just a clean brush with no paint and I just lightly dabbed away between the two colors. And using that sort of like makeup type brush that is very soft, especially with no paint, is a great way to get a very subtle transition between two colors or two different values. And my very last step of this was to just adjust the eyebrow, as I felt it was a bit too faint at the front and it was kind of throwing me off the entire time. And here we have the finished painting. It was such a journey from start to finish, but ultimately I do really like how the final painting came out, and I see many color studies in my future. I hope y'all liked the video and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!